So as Steve said, I'll go ahead and provide a little bit of an intro while Gary he should have a shared screen access while he is sharing his screen with his slides with us.
Perfect. And our colleague Nick is on to help as well. So we'll put our name and information in the chat as well.
That would be great. And we'll just remind Gary that he's muted when he starts talking. There we go. I'll give you a little background. As Steve said, my name is Deanna Day. I'm a librarian and market researcher with the Small Business Technology and Development Center. So I deal with entrepreneurs every day. And as a result, I have heard Gary speak. And I'm very excited that we were able to welcome him here today. I think you're going to find him very exciting. He has really emerged as an internationally recognized thought leader in the field of entrepreneurial mindset education. He is the founder of ELI, or the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. In that role, and other roles, he's influenced a broad audience from higher education and econ development organizations throughout the world, everyone from government, corporate, and nonprofit clients worldwide, including Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute, and the U.S. State Department. He also led the development of the Ice House Entrepreneurship, which many of you would be familiar with, and that has been recognized by the Kauffman Foundation as well as redefining entrepreneurship education in classrooms and communities around the world. With his focus on the entrepreneurial mindset, Schoeniger has presented numerous keynotes, workshops, and training programs throughout the U.S. and abroad. Recent engagements include the Global Entrepreneurship Congress in Rio de Janeiro and Moscow, as well as speaking and training programs in Athens, London, Bogota, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, Santiago, Aberdeen, Nicosia, Baku, and I'm sure there are many, many more that aren't listed. And he, along with Pulitzer nominee Clifton Taulbert, is one of the co-authors of Who Owns the Ice House, which I mentioned a minute ago, 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur, an international bestseller described as required reading for humanity. So with all of that, I'm very pleased to welcome Gary. I'm sure it's going to be a very enlightening and interesting hour with him. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Deanna. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today. I'm really excited to share with you some of what I've learned about entrepreneurship over the last few decades. And what I want to do today is sort of take you on a journey with me that I hope will help you redefine what the word entrepreneur or entrepreneurship means. So, you know, here we are in a time and a place where the world has changed in ways that now require all of us to be more innovative and entrepreneurial. And to think like entrepreneurs.
Here, do you have slides up? It's just a white screen. Everyone's just seeing white.
I'm showing that slides are being shared.
Okay.
You guys can't see slides?
No.
It's a white slide.
Okay.
Maybe stop sharing and reshare and make sure you're selecting Keynote.
Okay. Let me try this one more time.
That might have been the whiteboard.
Okay, so I'm going to share again. I clicked on the whiteboard. My bad. I see what I did. I clicked on the wrong icon. Okay.
Perfect. We can see it now.
Now you guys can see my slide. Okay,
it's beautiful.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that misstep. But as I was saying, the world has changed in ways that now require all of us to think like entrepreneurs. And I'm really trying to emphasize the think part of this, because I don't mean to say that everyone should start a business or quit their job or drop out of school or whatever to start a business. But we're all going to need to learn to think this way if we're going to adapt and thrive in this rapidly changing world that we all live in. And so that's what I've been studying for the last almost 30 years, is the mindset, is the underlying logic that drives entrepreneurial behavior. I want to pause for a second. Is there any way that the host or someone on your end can silence that dinging for when people are joining into the group? I don't know how to do that from my end. So
Gary,
that
I'm
would be
sorry.
great if you.
This is Steve. That's turned off for everyone except the co-hosts. So that's just going to happen. I'm sorry. I can't at this point. I have to shut down Zoom to reset the parameters of the session.
Okay.
I apologize.
I'll learn to deal with it. No problem. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it. Okay. So here where this all started for me. I've been an entrepreneur all of my life. In the early 1990s, in 1991, I opened the newspaper one morning and I saw a story. Some of you may recall there was a recession in 1991. Lots of jobs were going away. They weren't coming back. I opened the newspaper and I saw this story. It was a Metro section story about a man that had lost his job at a local factory, and the job wasn't coming back. And, unemployment benefits were running out. He was worried. They were worried about losing their home. His wife was working like 2 shifts at a convenience store to try to keep things together. And I looked at this story and I thought, I can see opportunities everywhere. And why can't he? And that was really the question that struck me. And I began to realize that because of my experience as an entrepreneur, that I learned to think differently. And if I could somehow deconstruct the mindset of an entrepreneur, that this could be useful to other humans. And I instantly thought, like, this could be useful for people, not only people who want to start their own business, but people who are looking to create more meaning and prosperity in their lives, regardless of their chosen path, regardless of their circumstances. I assumed that there was some sort of underlying logic that was driving the behavior. And that's what I became, some would say, obsessed with answering that question. So the question that I was really trying to figure out essentially is, how do underdogs win? So I wasn't interested in the Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk stories of the day. I was interested in understanding how ordinary people who have no particular advantage in life are able to recognize and actualize opportunities that the rest of us seem to overlook. How do they do it? And so that's the question that set me on this path. So fast forward a little bit. In 2008, I was hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California, to do 2 things. And they hired me to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in North America, and then to create some content around those gaps. And what I learned there, what I learned from that research is that the way that we typically think about entrepreneurship, much less the way that it's portrayed in the classroom, is largely divorced from the reality, from the boots on the ground reality of the mindset and the methods of a typical entrepreneur. So I came back to Cisco and I said, look, there's this curriculum that are, all about the high growth venture-backed entrepreneur, the Silicon Valley model, but that represents, a tiny, tiny fraction of the entrepreneurial activity in the United States, right? And it's really divorced from what the typical entrepreneur is actually doing. And well, Cisco came back to me and said, well, what is the typical entrepreneur actually doing? And I said, well, I'm going to have to do some more research. And they gave me the platform to go across the United States with a video crew and begin to interview what I would call everyday unlikely entrepreneurs. Now, I wish I had the rest of the day to tell you about some of the stories that I heard from people. And I'm going to tell you a few of those stories. But But that's where this journey really began in 2008 with the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute research. I began to interview these entrepreneurs, and I'm going to introduce you to some of those entrepreneurs in just a minute. But, you know, at first, this was sort of like an ethnographic research project, and I didn't really know what I was doing in the beginning, which is not unusual for an entrepreneur. But I started to hear, you know, stories, and you know, they were kind of interesting stories. You know, how all this crazy things people had been through. And it was only after we got to 30 or 40 or maybe 50 stories that these patterns started to emerge. But nevertheless, I want to introduce you to some of the entrepreneurs that I met along the way. Now, okay, let's see if this is going to work. But, you know, before I do that, one of the things that I wanted the points that I wanted to bring forth is that, you know, we have difficulty embracing entrepreneurship because of the ways in which we define it. Like, not only is it being mischaracterized in the classroom, but it's mischaracterized in our own minds. And so, you know, I'm just going to ask you all to think about, you know, what does the word entrepreneur conjure in your own mind when you hear this word? And for a lot of people, there's a visibility versus representation issue. We hear the word entrepreneur and it conjures the image of the Silicon Valley whiz kids, you know, from Stanford or Harvard or wherever, that come up with new technologies or new social media platforms that get millions in venture capital and off they go to the races. And what I found is that, you know, not only does this represent this model of entrepreneurship, I think at the Kauffman Foundation, they said it was like a fraction of a single % of all new companies are actually started that way. But I began to see the ways in which that we think about entrepreneurship is preventing us from embracing it. And so that's one of the key points that I wanted to introduce you to in this talk today. So let me go ahead and introduce you now to some of the entrepreneurs that I met in this journey. And I'll begin with a man named David Petit. David is a Native American, and he grew up on a reservation in very challenging, impoverished circumstances. He's about 6'6", so I don't know, you know, if that's a tribal name or whatever. You see, he's a very large guy, but David failed many times as an entrepreneur, and he told me something. He said, I failed because I was trying to make money for myself.
Hey, Gare.
And yeah.
Your slides aren't moving.
Can you see the picture of David?
No, we're still on your first slide.
You kidding me? All right. Let me go back to, let me find my slides. This is really interesting.
There we go. There's David.
Okay, so you can see David now. All right,
Yep.
Fair enough. Okay, so there's a picture of David. Long story short, Native American, grew up in poverty, parents divorced, alcoholic father. David became an entrepreneur. He failed several times, he told me, because he was only thinking about himself. And one day he saw a problem that he could solve. He read a story about a woman that had been robbed and stabbed and murdered at an ATM machine. And he came up with a way to create a camera that was connected to your key fob on your car keys that could activate a camera and alarm to protect people at an ATM. Well, David didn't have any formal training in technology. He went to the local library and taught himself how to write the code to bring that technology to life. Now, I will tell you, that's how he began. That technology that David invented in a library evolved to become the technology that manages the smart grid, the power system for the whole United States. I met a young man named Rodney Walker. Nick, can we see Rodney here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I met a man named Rodney. I met him when he was a rising junior at Morehouse College. Rodney also came from a very challenging background. Both his parents were addicted to drugs. Rodney grew up on the south side of Chicago. He was in 12 different foster homes at the age of 16 until he finally became homeless. He wasn't doing well in school. He said he had dropped out emotionally, but he just showed up in school because it was the only place where there was, plumbing and heat and some sort of stability in his life. As luck would have it, in his junior year, he took an entrepreneurship course. And that's where he said to me, when I took that course, I realized I could apply entrepreneurial thinking to my schoolwork. And Rodney went from a 1.2 GPA to a 4.0 in his senior year, was awarded a provisional scholarship to Morehouse. He's since gone on to Yale. He's now at Harvard University studying trauma-informed education. I met a lady named Dawn Hafiker, who was an Iraq War veteran, an Army captain, who was wounded in, I think it was 2004 in Baghdad. She's a West Point graduate. Her Humvee took a direct hit from an RPG. She woke up in a hospital, didn't know what had happened. She didn't realize that her colleagues had been killed. Her father was sitting next to her bed, and she realized that her right arm was severed at the shoulder. And she said to me, at that moment, I thought my life was over, that everything I had worked for had perished. And, she went on into rehab, and she said her mindset shifted one day when they wheeled her into rehab and she saw a man with no legs get up and take his first steps with his prosthetic legs. And she said to herself, my mindset shifted. And I thought, I'm only missing an arm. So she wanted to find a way that she could protect soldiers who are still in harm's way. She connected with an idea to bring modern cauterization techniques to the battlefield. She started a company around that called Hafiker and Associates. Last time I checked, she had over 200 employees. I met Serena Moore Thomas, who at the age of 17, while she was in high school, got pregnant with twins. When she was 18 years old, her and her father took $200. They created a construction site cleaning company that now employs more than 50 people around the world, across, they're in Philadelphia. So one of the most astonishing entrepreneurs and one of the most compelling stories I met, I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and by random chance, I met this man named Clifton Taulbert. And honestly, we were in Tulsa to interview someone differently, a man named, I've forgotten his name now. We went to Tulsa to interview a blind guy that had lost his eyesight and then created a way for blind people to watch television with their ears. His name was Jim Stovall, I just remembered it. We were done with that interview at noon, and I started asking perfect strangers, do you know any other entrepreneurs in Tulsa? And someone said to me, you should talk to Clifton Taulbert. All they told me about him was he's an amazing entrepreneur. He was one of the early founders of the Stairmaster exercise company. So I said, great, I got his contact information. This was 2008. We didn't all have smartphones, so I didn't have a chance to really learn much about him. I just called him on the phone. I said, Mr. Taulbert, we're in Tulsa for, just today. Is there any way we can come to your office and do an interview for this Cisco research project? And he agreed. I showed up in his office a few hours later with a film crew. And the first question I asked him was, Mr. Taulbert, how did you learn how to become an entrepreneur? What influenced you? What happened in your life? Were you born that way, or did somebody influence you to think that way? And I'll never forget, and at the time, I didn't know that he was a Pulitzer nominee, that he'd written 12 books. He'd been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He had been lectured to the Supreme Court. He'd done all these amazing things. All I knew at that moment was he was part of Stairmaster. Nevertheless, I asked him how he learned how to think like an entrepreneur. And he looked off in the middle distance and he said to me, before this word entrepreneur became popular, the concept still existed. And he went on to explain to me that he was born in this poor cotton community, Glen Allen, Mississippi. It's a very small community in the Mississippi Delta. He was born to a teenage mother, didn't know a father. And he said, for people that look like me, the work was in the fields. And he said, since I was a little boy, when I wasn't in school, I was expected to be working in the cotton fields, picking and chopping cotton. And he said, when I was 13 years old, I went to work for my Uncle Cleve, and he pulled this photograph out of a shoebox, and the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. And he said, this is the man that taught me how to think like an entrepreneur. And he described his uncle as a man of maybe a 4th or a 5th grade education. He said there was no one in our community that had banking was just an unfamiliar concept. But my Uncle Cleve, every 2 weeks, he took money to the bank. And they wouldn't let us in the front door. We had to go in the back door, but he was putting money in the bank. And as Clifton started to describe to me what he was learning from his uncle, I recognized that the concepts that his uncle was teaching him were the same concepts I had now heard hundreds of times. I realized that there's this underlying logic that transcends time, socioeconomics, race, culture, gender. There's this underlying logic that's driving the behavior of the entrepreneur. So about a year later, I convinced Clifton that we needed to work together, that we needed to use his story to help the world understand these 8 core concepts, what we call the 8 life lessons from unlikely entrepreneurs. So he and I collaborated on this book. We got initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation, and we created a curriculum around it called the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. So I want to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'm excited to announce our partnership with EBSCO. So as we were contemplating, based on the research we had done at Cisco, I wanted to create an entrepreneurial mindset program that would demystify and democratize entrepreneurship. I wanted to expose this basic logic to a broad range of people, even those beyond those who may be interested in starting a business, not to exclude them, but to go beyond them. And as I found is that the entrepreneurial attitudes and skills are the attitudes and skills that the world now demands. I wanted to create a program that would inspire the students, and I wanted to use the real world examples. And so what we did was we took some of the video vignettes from our interviews and we included them in the curriculum so that students could learn from the firsthand experience of the entrepreneurs, the real world underdog or the unlikely entrepreneurs. We wanted to create an experiential program that immersed the learner in entrepreneurial experiences. We wanted to create a program that focused on the mindset and the broader applicability. We wanted to connect the entrepreneurial classroom with the entrepreneurial community. What I'm saying here is that there are Uncle Cleves and Aunt Cleves in every community. We wanted to connect the learner with the local entrepreneurs. And lastly, we wanted to create a program where the person delivering the program did not need to be a subject matter expert. What we saw is that, people that were teaching entrepreneurship, they'd never really been entrepreneurial. So the programs that were the most effective relied on serial entrepreneurs that had bought and sold, created businesses all their lives. We looked at the process and said, entrepreneurship is really a discovery process. The teacher, the instructor does not need to be a subject matter expert. They need to be a facilitator of learning, the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage, the sage on the stage, the sage on the stage, excuse me. So now what I want to do is share with you very briefly these 8 core concepts that we gleaned from hundreds of entrepreneurs that became the basis of the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. And I'll be very brief about these, a lot to dig into here. But one of the common themes is choice. And what we realize in interviewing entrepreneurs is that they're choosing their future rather than allowing their circumstances to dictate their future, right? And if you talk to an entrepreneur, very quickly, they'll start to describe some sort of a vision, some sort of a compelling goal, something on the horizon they're striving for. The second concept we gleaned is that the entrepreneurs look at problems as opportunities, right? They recognize that by solving problems for others, they empower themselves. And so they look at every problem, every frustration, every unmet need as a potential opportunity. They have a bias towards action, right? They don't spend a lot of time in a formal planning or formal research mode. They act. And to the uninitiated, this looks like unbridled enthusiasm, but what they're actually doing is they're learning through experimentation and adaptation. They learn to micro-experiment, which allows them to tease out opportunities that are latent, that are present but not visible. Another profound insight that came from this observation and analysis of these underdog entrepreneurs is they're constantly in search of knowledge. They're not necessarily learning in formal means, but they're constantly learning, right? They're learning through online courses, through YouTube videos, through audio books or regular books or social networks or whatever, but they're constantly seeking knowledge. They also learn how to create wealth by being resourceful. And in the short version of this, what we observed is they're really quite frugal. They learn how to invest their time, their resources, their efforts rather than spending. I'll leave it there. There's a lot to unpack there. They become reliable. They recognize that they build a brand or a reputation for being reliable. They're essentially creating their own luck generation machine. The more reliable they become, the more people that know that they're reliable, the more opportunities tend to come their way. They tend to create learning communities, right? They create these like organic like communities of practice. They surround themselves with other entrepreneurs to help learn and grow. And lastly, they model a persistence. There's a high degree of resilience, which we now know stems from what psychologists call an optimistic explanatory style. Essentially, they have a positive outlook. They have an optimistic outlook. They have a future positive orientation, which enables them to persist. Since we launched the Icehouse program in 2011, and ironically, we launched it at the Kauffman Foundation, supported a big gala we did at a place in Washington, D.C. And just in my social media feed, the 10 years ago today that came up, ironically. So since we launched in 2011, it was November of 2011, we've trained more than 2,700 facilitators around the world, have been trained to deliver the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. It's being used in ways we could have never imagined. This is a sample from a project that's happening right now in Erie, Pennsylvania. It was supported by the United Way Foundation, where each year about 1,000 middle school students in the Erie, Pennsylvania public schools are going through the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. We were absolutely astonished by what we saw there. High schools, one example, a network of high schools across Mexico, Prepa Tech, about 7,500 students a year going through the Icehouse program as their final course before they go to university. Here's another shocking experience we had as the course began to be adopted in community colleges across the country and around the world, that we noticed an enormous impact on student persistence. At Pikes Peak Community College, under the leadership of Dr. Lance Bolton, we did a 1,000 student blind study, and we found that the students that took the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program persisted to the next semester at a rate that was 28% higher than the control group. And Dr. Bolton said to me, initially he thought it was 2.8%, that they just omitted the decimal point, and they went back and recrunched the data. It was in fact 28% impact. The program is being used in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to train city government workers how to think like an entrepreneur. And this initiative is led by one of our facilitators, Tom Darling, who was initially teaching at Central New Mexico Community College. The mayor was so impacted by the first cohort, which was only 100 employees, that they're now taking 6,000 city government workers through the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. A nonprofit organization led by Tom Rue, formerly of the Kauffman Foundation, called the NC IDEA Foundation in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, is using the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program to train 100,000 people across the state of North Carolina to empower them with an entrepreneurial mindset. And I just want to pause here and say, if you look up in the corner right here, you can see our friend Duncan Smith. That's where he was introduced to the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. So since we launched, we've gotten a lot of great press, NPR, CNN, USA Today, the Huffington Post. More astonishing to me, we were recognized at the United Nations. Tom Rue, when he was at the Kauffman Foundation, was invited to present the Icehouse program at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. He was also invited to present the program to a Papal Council on Peace and Justice at the Vatican. And one of the things that Tom said to me there was that the lady who was directing this council, when he was done, she said, I wonder if the council should conclude that an entrepreneurial mindset is a basic human right. It's an interesting observation. I was personally invited to present the Icehouse program to the European Commission in Brussels about 3 years ago. So that's just some of the accolades and the recognition we've had around the world. But what I'm really, really excited about is our partnership with EBSCO to bring the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program to libraries across the United States and around the world. I am beyond excited about this partnership to bring this program into the libraries. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just want to wrap up. I'm going to leave some time for questions or comments, and hopefully you can put them in the chat. But one of the things that I've learned from this discovery, this journey that I've been on, is a simple definition of entrepreneurship that anyone can embrace. And that is, entrepreneurship is a self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And the second part of the definition is that by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. And I don't just mean empower economically, I mean empower holistically. What we've learned is that when a human is able, when any of us are able to pursue our own interests and develop our own innate abilities in ways that contribute to the greater good, we become optimally engaged. We tap into the most potent form of human motivation, which is intrinsic motivation. It all begins with this simple assumption that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to others. And by doing so, I can empower myself. That is the most often tacit assumption from which all other entrepreneurial behavior tends to emerge. So I want to end with one more story this is a more recent story. I'm launching a new podcast called the Entrepreneurial Mindset Project. And last Friday, I interviewed a man named Deshaun Willis, and there's a picture of Deshaun. And Deshaun started mowing his own parents' lawn, and he said something very simple to me. He said, you know, I just took pride in my work. I just tried to do a nice job. And people started to drive by and ask me if I would come and cut their lawn. And then, you know, so more and more neighbors started to ask him to cut the grass. He didn't have a lot of money. His father gave him an old broken down van, and he was using that to expand his business. And the van broke down one day, and he said, I can't just leave my customers. And what he did was he figured out how to put a gasoline engine on his bicycle, and he strapped his lawnmower and his weed whacker to the back of his bicycle so he can continue to serve his customers and grow his business. Well, what happened was people in Toledo started driving around. People started taking pictures of him and making fun of him. And they posted some picture of him somewhere on social media, said only in Toledo would you see something like this. But the media, Deshaun actually reposted the picture on his social media page, and it sort of took off. People started to support him. They started a GoFundMe campaign, and it really helped to lift his business. But I wanted to share this picture with you as I'm just wrapping up here today to sort of, you know, that's the entrepreneurial spirit, it's hope. And that's what we're seeing here. That's what hope looks like. So if I could wrap up this with one simple comment, it's I've come to see that the entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. And it's not just in some of us, it resides within us all. And not every one of us wants to start a business, but we all have the innate desire to become engaged in work that matters, to be recognized for our work, and to be part of a community, to see our work contribute to the greater community. And I think the reason why I'm so excited about our partnership with EBSCO to bring the Icehouse program to libraries is libraries are the hub of learning for the common person. That's their access. I set out on this journey to democratize and demystify entrepreneurship. There's no better place to do that than within a library. So thank you all for listening to my talk. I hope this is something that's interesting to you. You can find me on social media. You can find us at elimindset.com. I'm happy to pause. I think we have about another 20 minutes or so. So I'm happy to stop talking and address whatever questions you might have.
If you could post your questions in the chat, I think that Joni and Nick will coordinate responses for that. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Deanna.
Deanna.
Yes.
So I see Rachel here saying that Spokane is working with Icehouse. Well, that's from you, Nick. Okay, sorry. So what questions do you have? How has this shaped or shifted your idea of what it means to be entrepreneurial?
Gary, this is from Mimi. Gary, did you interview people who tried but did not succeed? Why didn't they? So failed entrepreneurs.
Yes, great question, Mimi. And I never set out to interview failed entrepreneurs, but almost every entrepreneur I interviewed had failure in their background. And I can tell you, so that's the first part of my answer. But the second part of the answer is, I think, more telling. And I think, broadly speaking, and I gleaned this when I was doing the research at Cisco, but entrepreneurs fail very often because they're only trying to serve their own needs, right? And this is one of the great, profound lessons of entrepreneurship. The simple secret hiding in plain sight is that we get what we want by helping other people get what they want. So the formula for failure is, I want to open a coffee shop because I hate my job and I don't want to drive too far and I don't want to learn too much. I have no evidence that there's a need for another coffee shop in our community. I just want to do that because it fills my own need. That's the rest. That's why they fail, Mimi. They build it and they will come. They have a build it and they will come mentality. The ones that succeed, they find the problem first. They're really good at finding the problem. They validate, they diagnose the problem, and then they prescribe a solution. That's really the important part of the lessons to be learned from your question, Mimi. Thank you for asking it.
Great. Jennifer's asking, what can academic libraries do when it's not listed in their duties and administrators are asking us to do more with less?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Like, what can academic librarians do with the program, or what can they do to be more innovative and entrepreneurial?
Let's go with both, but maybe starting with the second point, being more innovative and entrepreneurial.
Yeah. And I think that's the short answer to that question is the way forward requires trial and error. It requires something that I call micro experimentation. And that's really one of the secret weapons of the entrepreneur, because it's the micro experimentation that starts to enable us to get at the deep assumptions, the deeply held, deeply ingrained beliefs and taken for granted assumptions that might be blinding us to opportunities that exist within every set of circumstances. So, I don't like when people say think outside the box. I think that's sort of a trite saying that it's not very meaningful. Like, what is the box? Where are the boundaries of the box? I mean, how do you think outside the box when you don't know where the box is? But the sentiment of the statement is still important. And that is that the box are the deeply held, taken for granted assumptions that we've bought into that once enabled us to succeed that are now hindering our ability to adapt.
And if you could also talk a little bit about how the Icehouse program can be a tool in that regard. Jennifer was saying she'd like to hear about that as well.
How can it be a tool for
assisting the academic librarians specifically who are receiving kind of administrator pushback and or lack of resources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that question. I have to think about that for a minute. But what I'm seeing mostly in higher education is that entrepreneurship is sort of looked at as a business discipline. And I'm looking at it as a behavioral phenomenon. So I don't even really think of it as a business discipline. And I know that once you figure out something useful, then you need to learn some business skills if you want to make that useful thing into a business. But the premise of our program is this, that the attitudes and skills required to discover an opportunity are quite distinct from the attitudes and skills required to exploit that opportunity. And so, the former are entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. The latter are business or managerial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. So I'm not sure how to answer the question of how do you integrate this into an academic library if the organization, if the institution has not embraced entrepreneurship. Now, I can tell you that colleges and universities around the world are using Icehouse as sort of the introduction to entrepreneurship on the front end of their program. So that's one way to answer the question. If there's an entrepreneurship program in your college or university, it might behoove you to connect with the people that are running that program and use this for an intro to entrepreneurship. Another way to answer this question is that we have now a student success version of this, which is meant for all incoming freshmen to expose them to an entrepreneurial mindset that will empower them to succeed in college and in life. So it's not really, it's outside of the business domain. It's more of a freshman seminar or a student success application.
Awesome. Okay, a couple nice comments here. One from Elizabeth about the Deshaun story and how interesting she finds that people are making fun of his ingenuity. Where are we as a society when people are making fun of hard work, dedication, and creative problem solving? I couldn't agree more with that.
I agree with it, but I want to proffer like maybe a different way to look at it. Like again, I'm looking at this as a behavioral phenomenon, and humans, like we're organisms in a system, right? And when any one of those organisms starts behaving differently, it makes the system uncomfortable, right? And so that's really all that's really happening. When someone behaves in a way that's outside of a norm, they're likely to suffer ridicule. And that's part of any entrepreneur's journey. Like, you know, all ideas are almost all good ideas are initially rejected. And I think there's an evolutionary component to that. You know, we live longer when we sort of recoil from novelty. But you know, I think that's part of what's going on. It's just a natural phenomenon.
Sure. Okay. Allison is saying, and Allison, thank you. Shout out, as Stephen put in the chat, for live tweeting this presentation. That's been really great to see. But really just emphasizing the importance of putting the facilitator in that facilitator seat rather than forcing them to be a subject matter expert is super impactful for librarians who may not have any experience with entrepreneurship. So just really giving us accolades for that.
Yeah.
Amelia,
So let me just can I just touch on that for 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nick? It's a really important point. You know, the structure of the Icehouse program. Some of the research there came from Albert Bandura's work in self-efficacy. And so the role of the facilitator is modeled after Bandura's work in developing self-efficacy. And there's 4 sort of ingredients here that we coach the facilitator on. So in order to get someone to move from a helpless to a mastery orientation, and that's sort of the spectrum, what Bandura is saying is we need these 4 basic ingredients. And the first ingredient is we need some kind of a small efficacy moment. I call it a bat hit the ball moment. We need to feel that maybe this is possible for us. The second thing we need is we need to see relatable social models. We need to see people who come from similar or worse circumstances succeeding in this domain. And for the love of God, unless you're at Stanford or an elite university, you know, we need to stop showing Mark Zuckerberg or Henry Ford or Thomas Edison as the exemplars of entrepreneurship. The third thing we need is someone who believes in us. We need a mentor, you know, so a coach, a guide, someone who will just dig and, you know, encourage us to dig deeper, run faster, or jump higher. In the beginning of Icehouse, that's the facilitator, but we're encouraging the student to find their own mentors, and that's the community piece. And the last thing they need is to develop an internal locus of control, to start to learn how to manage their own emotions, to manage their time, to not allow the emotional tail to wag the rational dog, as Daniel Kahneman is fond of saying. So thank you for that comment, Nick. Sorry for the long-winded.
No worries. That was great. Great expansion on that. Just trying to make sure I'm not missing anything. There are a couple sort of duplicative points, so I want to make sure we're capturing all of those. Amelia is asking about what types of folks are kind of attracted to the program when it's offered in a library. In Montana, we are starting to venture into entrepreneurship / small business programming in libraries. And my impression, which may or may not be accurate, is that people seem to want or appreciate targeted resources and services, whereas the Icehouse program seems to be more open-ended. Very exciting to think about, but since we're starting with this area of focus, it's hard for me to see how it's implemented. So just kind of digging into that, Icehouse being on the front end as a way to expose a redefinition of entrepreneurship as opposed to being purely about specific tools. If you could talk kind of on that.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And I think there's two primary groups, I think, the library, in a public library, that you're probably going for with Icehouse. And that is, those who want to start a business, definitely, but like workforce development, like that's really where people have an aha moment. We've had a lot of success there. And a lot of the current workforce initiatives are directed at teaching new skills, but they're not getting at the underlying mindset, right? And so I think the Icehouse program is probably has its most potential in a public library in the domain of workforce development.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, partnering with any economic development or small business development centers that are in your community is a great way to kind of spearhead this effort. The library can kind of be the space that anyone can get into, and for those who may not be necessarily thinking of themselves as starting a business, to kind of dip their toes in the entrepreneurial water. And just got a message, we're coming up on the 5-minute warning. So for those of you that were not able to get to questions of, I will repost my initial welcome message just so you have my email as well as Joni's. And then I'll throw Duncan's in there as well. So if there's any, EBSCO or library specific questions, you can send those to him directly as well. But Gary, just to get you going,
Kylie, thanks for posting the Bandura stuff, Kylie. I just want to say thanks for doing that.
Absolutely. That's, super helpful. Where was I? So many great comments, everyone. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is from Mark. How does this ELI tool reach/engage those who don't already have these 8 characteristic skills? So kind of talking about building the skills within folks. How best do we expand this to those who haven't already self-selected into entrepreneurship?
Yeah. So
another way to say that would be, how is the course designed to build these skills rather than only for those who already have them?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in this way. In psychology, there's a term called the fundamental attribution error, and it's a fancy way of saying like we assign the wrong cause to the effect. So we look at successful entrepreneurs. Somebody does something amazing. Forbes or some magazine comes and does a big story about them, and they come away and they write some piece that says, these are the 8 things or the 10 things or the 3 things or the 5 things that you need to be a successful entrepreneur. And that's usually misguided, right? You don't have to have any of these things when you begin. You develop the entrepreneurial mindset is an effect of the pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. It's not something you have and then you go. So I don't know if that makes sense. It's an effect more so than the cause of the behavior. But another way to frame the question is you ask people, not everyone wants to start a business, but who wants to discover an opportunity? Is there anyone on this webinar today, in this conference, that does not want to discover an opportunity? So I think reframing it is one way to engage people that may not self-identify as entrepreneurs.
Agreed. Okay. I did want to point out for those who are not, who are worried about losing the chat, the 3 dots on the right-hand side next to the kind of the subject line of the chat function, there's a save chat function there. So if you want to keep some of the comments as well as the links that we've been sharing, including some of our case studies that I threw in there, feel free to do that.
So I think we're about out of time. Thank you to everyone who participated and all the great questions. And as Nick said, he's posted his email address there so that you can reach out to him afterwards. And I saw several questions about whether the slides would be available. And yes, they will be available to everyone. So thank you again, Gary. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Deanna. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Deanna and Steve, everyone. Thank you so much.
Could you all share a reaction for Gary and Nick and also Joni? Thank you all. All right, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then Morgan is going to be emceeing the next slot of speakers. And we'll be quiet until Morgan wants to say something to you.
Hey everyone, looking forward to our next discussion. I see that Audrey, LaMonica, and Jen have all been made co-host.